I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's Home and Hove, and welcome to our next step in our walking tour through the Bible. And we're now going to talk about that favourite topic of all Catholics, sin. A particular favourite because we're not going to be talking about our own sins, we're going to be talking about other people's sins. Now, we're looking at chapters 12 and 13 of the first book of the Kings, which tell us about the splitting of the two kingdoms. Kingdom of Judah goes one way, the kingdom of Israel goes the other way. People who read the Bible very attentively say that in the reign of King David and the reign of King Solomon, the union between Israel and Judah was in fact a personal union, a bit like the union between Scotland and England was a personal union from the reigns of James I through to Queen Anne. Under the Stuarts, it happened to be what you'd call a dual monarchy. And similarly, Israel and Judah are a dual monarchy, and you get that impression if you read carefully between the lines. Now, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, has been made king of Judah, and he goes north to Israel to be confirmed as king of Israel. However, the people of Israel present their complaints to him. Now, this is standard, isn't it? The subjects of the king present their complaints. This happened at the time of the French Revolution. Just before, the people sent in their complaints to the States General. These complaints were collected in books which were known as cahiers de doléances, exercise books of complaints. And we all love to complain about the government as well, don't we? And every time there's a change of regime, we expect a change of policy. And so the people come to Rehoboam with a not unnatural expectation that he should moderate his father's policy. And it's one particular policy they're worried about. That is the policy of forced labour. That is to say, King Solomon, with all his buildings and with all his his grands projets, as they call them in French, to use yet another phrase, has relied on another French word, la corvée, which is basically forcing the peasantry to work on his project a certain amount of days of the year for free. This is called forced labor. Must have been the thing that built the pyramids as well in Egypt. And the people feel that they've been overworked, and therefore they want this to be moderated. Now, Rehoboam does what a king should do. He asks advice. He asks advice of the elders who counsel moderation, but he also asks the advice of his young friends, his contemporaries, and they say, under no circumstances should you show weakness, or so I interpret it. Rather, you should tell the people that you'll be even harsher than your father, King Solomon. In other words, you need to stamp your authority on the kingdom right now, right at the beginning. But of course, this doesn't work. It causes a revolt. And don't forget, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, had been in Egypt in exile, waiting for this moment. He's come back and he drives out Rehoboam and Rehoboam's people, and Jeroboam becomes the king of Israel and sets up another kingdom. And in fact, again, it's almost like a bit of a famous incident in The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. One of Rehoboam's henchmen is stoned to death by the people of Israel. And so that shows us just how unpopular Solomon's regime had become in Israel. And similarly, similar things happened at the French Revolution, if you remember, in that the royal government just broke down because all the king's men were driven out, murdered, hung from lampposts, and so on, went into exile. So Rehoboam's regime collapses in Israel. Jeroboam takes over the kingdom. So what was the sin of Rehoboam? Well, the sin of Rehoboam was listening to the wrong people, taking bad advice. So not really a sin. He asked for advice and he got conflicting advice and he just went the wrong way. Rehoboam, I think, is condemned as stupid rather than purely malicious. And yet he is not without malice, because it's clear that the people have got a genuine complaint. And Rehoboam has absolutely no sympathy with the common people, because he says this stupid thing to them: although my father laid a heavy yoke on you, I shall make it heavier still. My father controlled you with the whip, but I shall apply a spiked lash. So he talks a big tough man, but also he portrays himself as a fool, somebody who's cut off, somebody who's living in the bubble, somebody who's got no kindness and no compassion. So you really don't have any sympathy for Rehoboam. The other thing he betrays is, of course, the fact that he doesn't seem to know the history of the children of Israel. They had been slaves in Egypt. They didn't want to be slaves of anyone, not even King Solomon or King Rehoboam. And he doesn't seem to appreciate the irony of the fact that they left Egypt to get away from slavery, but here they are under the king, and they're in another sort of form of slavery. So that is the sin of Rehoboam, being tone deaf to the needs of others, the lack of compassion, the lack of fellow feeling. Now, what about the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which is constantly harped on in the books of the kings? Well, Jeroboam rebels against Rehoboam, the rightful sovereign, but nobody seems to mind that at all. Rehoboam has lost the kingdom because of the mistakes he's made. They elect, we assume, Jeroboam to be their king, and that's perfectly okay. What Jeroboam does is he sets up rival temples at Bethel and at Dan, and in each of these rival temples, he installs a golden calf. Again, somebody with no sense, somebody who seems to have forgotten the history of Israel. Because remember the trouble the golden calf caused at the foot of Mount Sinai. Now, Jeroboam is not giving the people idols to worship. The idea of the golden calf is that God, the invisible God, somehow or another hovers above the golden calf. And you don't worship the golden calf, you worship God, who is invisible. The golden calf just marks the place where God is. That, reading between the lines, is Jeroboam's intention. However, so opposed to idol worship are the people of Israel and the prophets in particular, that anything which has got a graven image involved, that is a golden calf, is anathema, is idol worship. Therefore, he is tarred with this brush of idol worship. And indeed, the first commandment says, you shall have no graven images at all. The people of Israel are against idol worship. That means they're against all representational art. They're aniconic. They have no images whatsoever. And even today in synagogues, you will not find an image of a single living thing. So you won't have photographs or you won't have statues or anything like that. It's all completely wrong. So we're against idol worship, or they're against idol worship, and we're against anything that might tempt people to idol worship, or anything that might even look like idol worship. The other thing that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, has done is he has caused a religious schism. Now, a schism is a rent. That's what it means, a tear in the cloth. He has broken away religiously from Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem. He's also set up his own priesthood, and these aren't proper priests because they're not descendants of Levi. Jeroboam reminds me of Henry VIII, who broke away from the Church of Rome, set up his own church, and set up his own priesthood. And eventually his daughter Elizabeth set up a priesthood which was not the Catholic priesthood. It had the outward form of certain aspects of the Catholic priesthood, but was not the Catholic priesthood. In other words, Elizabeth inaugurated a whole new religion. And this is what Jeroboam, son of Nebat, is accused of doing. And he is fomenting religious division. And we know what Dante did to those people. He put them in the very deepest pit of hell. Religious unity is what God wants. And religious unity, and there's a very important clue here in this passage, these two chapters. Religious unity, religion, faith, the unity of faith is based on the unity of worship. Therefore, one temple, one priesthood, one ceremonial, one liturgy, one people of faith. And Jeroboam has sinned by setting up a new liturgy with a new calendar in new temples with new priests, and therefore inaugurating a completely new religion. In those days, I am absolutely certain people went around saying, oh yeah, you say Jeroboam, son of Nebat, is a heretic and a schismatic. Oh, he's not. It's exactly the same. What goes on in Bethel and what goes on in Dan is exactly the same as the temple. And they would have been right in a certain sense that they looked the same. In fact, it was designed to look the same. But they would have been wrong. It wasn't the same. Because it had not been sanctioned by God. It had been set up by man. I think that's very important as well. So let us stick with what we have inherited. Let us stick with the Church of God and not go off in any newfangled directions. So we've heard of the sin of Rehoboam. We've heard of the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Let's avoid both those sins. Let's avoid the sin of oppression and hard-heartedness. Let's avoid the sin of splitism, as the Chinese Communist Party calls it, or what we call schism, the most serious sin I think you can commit, really. All the very best. Bye.